All right, well, this is the last PowerPoint kind of accompaniment video. This is video number 17. What is Metaphysics Part 2 and 3? And really the last portion of the conversation about metaphysics has to do with more recent developments in metaphysics, that is to say, the transcendental idealism and empiricism of Immanuel Kant, his sort of Copernican revolution coming out of the Enlightenment period, with metaphysics, which had kind of fallen into sort of disrepair, philosophically speaking, until Kant came along and sort of turned the whole set of arguments on its head. He takes on David Hume and the empiricism arguments and other things, and we'll trace in the PowerPoint how, even up to the current day, Immanuel Kant's perspective on metaphysical questions really ruled and reigned the day until Alvin Plantinga, who's a renowned, actually, scholar and Christian philosopher, really refuted very basically by putting the burden of proof back on Kant in our time, in our day, the whole Kantian revolution with regard to metaphysics. Where that's taken us and left us now is in a postmodern, distinctly postmodern place for those who are not adhering to a Christian worldview. At the beginning of the PowerPoint, I focus in on an example from pop music. And if you remember from the first week, basically, and then throughout, I've tried to weave as much as I can in the short period of time that we have different examples from pop culture, music, film, art that exemplify the current expressions of some of these more abstract philosophical concepts in our times, and exemplify them in the case of Nirvana and Kurt Cobain quite dramatically. Kurt Cobain was is currently, even though he's passed away some years ago by suicide, 1994 specifically, around on April 5th, 1994, he was found dead of suicide, shot himself with a shotgun in his little apartment in the Seattle suburb. His death rocked a generation. But even today, a lot of people don't realize that Kurt Cobain's music is so incredibly popular that his estate is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of nearly $1 billion. In fact, it's said by most people that are in the industry who are knowledgeable enough about the industry that Kurt Cobain is one of the most, or one of the best-selling deceased pop music artists in history. In other words, when you rank, groups that are out of business, or people like Elvis who died, Kurt Cobain and others, basically when it comes to top sales continuing up through this day, there's the Beatles, in rock and roll. There's everybody else, including people like Michael Jackson, Elvis, on and on it goes. And between everybody else and the Beatles is Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. I mean, millions and millions of songs are still sold by Nirvana and Cobain, because they struck such a deep chord in a Generation X to be specific, the 80s and the 90s, but well beyond that. What's significant about Cobain we talk about a little bit in the PowerPoint, and that is that he is an existentialist with a nihilistic focus. In fact, he picked up much of what he believed from Buddhism, which, unlike the popular notion, is very different religious system than any other, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or what have you. In fact, the notion of God is not even a part of formal Buddhism. A lot of people don't realize that Buddhism itself has no musical tradition, that it actually has chanting, if anything, as a form of meditation. But in terms of any musical expression, Buddhism, formally speaking, is completely devoid. That's significant because, it's ironic that a guy like Kurt Cobain would find so much resonance with this nihilistic point of view, which basically sees life as nothing but suffering and death as a relief from that suffering, and absorption of the self into the greater reality of existential being. There's very little personal hope in Buddhism, formally taught and studied and expressed, and that ran consistent with Cobain's experience, being abused as a young person, having his parents be divorced. He was addicted to drugs. There's a number of terrible things that took place in his life, though he's an incredibly gifted musician, that led to his despair and his suicide. The idea in Buddhism that really attracted him was this sense of the self as an illusion. That's the existential kind of view of the self as nothing more than a sort of shadow being. And again, death being a relief, ultimately, of the pain and burden of existence itself. When he committed suicide, a lot of people don't realize either that immediately, within 48 hours, there were 68 copycat suicides specifically documented, specifically copycat. These weren't people that were just motivated to suicide because Cobain did it, or they did it specifically in honor of him. Again, it's hard to overstate the impact of Cobain and Nirvana. Nirvana, the name of the group, is a Buddhist term, that describes the after world of shedding the self and all of its suffering for the ultimate experience of group reality. That's Nirvana, basically. And so it's difficult to really overstate the incredible impact that Cobain made on people's consciousness. Well, it's not a stretch to realize that the reason that he resonated so thoroughly with people, and still does, is that people find common experience with him and an empathy of their experience with him as one, as a generation that's suffering, or generations that are suffering in the difficulty and cruelty of the postmodern era. Again, just using this as an example to describe that philosophical ideas, in this case Buddhist religious ideas, couched in philosophical concepts like existentialism and nihilism, which is the complete rejection of any hope or meaning or significance in life, and an embrace, really, of despair, are very alive and real in our culture, and people resonate with those things because their experience in life, in the more painful chapters, teaches them that life has a quality to it, especially in suffering, that can be seen as absurd and pointless and meaningless and just, like a cruel joke. I think the Bible describes that sense of existential reality quite well. Read Ecclesiastes, the Psalms, other places. But instead of adopting, this nihilistic point of view, rather sees suffering as a much different journey with a personal God sort of navigating with you and through it with you in the experience. So again, very different views going on here, competing for people's attention. But I want to offer up, this kind of pop music example as an example of what people like and what they resonate with in our times, and how, some of the views down deep that are informing these songs. Check out the video of Cobain and Nirvana playing "Smells Like Teen Spirit," and it's one of their number one, if not number one, hits of all time. And you'll get a sense just within the lyric and the music of an experience, an existential experience being communicated, of being torn within oneself. The music itself is is dissonant and is in conflict. Ba 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 ba. It goes back and forth. It's like two men wrestling in a sack, in pain and suffering context that Cobain is trying to give voice and vocality to. And people resonate with that because their lives are fractured and suffering in the ways that he knew so well. And so, again, just offering this as an example that philosophical ideas, even as negative and as destructive as nihilism and existentialism can be in its worst conception, are very much alive and well in our culture. And they deal with metaphysical questions, posturing and proposing certain answers that we have to be careful to discern and be careful to, figure out what the root of those ideas are and where they logically lead in the life and in the existence of people. And so I just want to commend that to you for consideration. Think about the implications of what I said, the popularity and so on, and realize that, these ideas that we're talking about in this class, especially the metaphysical ideas, are very easily noticed as being quite influential in the times in which we live. And so considering them, knowing about them, being educated and thinking clearly about why they're not only not desirable views to hold to, but are quite deceptive and destructive, is a very important part of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a person of faith who is ready always to give a defense, as Peter says, for the hope that is within us, because it's a real hope. The Christian worldview intersected philosophy after the first century and changed forever some of the basic tenets. We've gotten into that a little bit, but realize that the gospel is not just a hopeful set of ideas. It is, as Paul describes in the New Testament, the power of God unto salvation. It is a force that counters in its perfection and in its power the dualistic, the deceptive philosophies, even as Paul describes in the New Testament, that capture the hearts and the minds of human beings and lead them quite literally to self-destructive ends. So be aware of all these things. I hope you enjoy this particular PowerPoint and the examples given, and that you get a lot out of consideration on this one. So thanks for joining this particular lecture.